Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the Ruby programming language. And if you're listening to this, you're probably interested in learning more about Ruby. We've got some fascinating sources lined up. We're going to explore everything from its history to what makes it unique to how it stacks up against the competition.
It's really interesting how Ruby came about. The creator Yukihiro Matsumoto wasn't just trying to build another programming language. He was actually looking for a way to make coding more enjoyable.
A programming language designed for happiness. That's intriguing. So tell me more about Matt's and his vision. What were some of his influences and how did he bring them together to create Ruby?
Well, Mats was inspired by a whole bunch of languages like Perl, Smalltalk, Eiffel, even Ada, and Lisp. And each of these contributed something to Ruby's DNA. For instance, from Perl, he borrowed its practicality and ability to manipulate text. And then from Smalltalk, he drew inspiration for Ruby's object-oriented nature, which is really central to how it works.
So it sounds like he was handpicking the best features from different languages and blending them into something new. Did this vision of like a developer-friendly language take hold immediately, or was it a gradual process?
Yeah, you're right. It definitely wasn't an overnight success. It took time for Ruby to gain traction. But there was a pivotal moment that really propelled it into the spotlight, the emergence of Ruby on Rails in 2004.
Ah, Rails.
Yeah.
The framework that put Ruby on the map. I've heard it completely changed the game for web development. What was so revolutionary about it?
Rails really was revolutionary. It brought structure and efficiency to web application development, and it did it in a way that just perfectly complemented Ruby's strengths. One of the key innovations was this concept of convention over configuration, which just dramatically simplified the development process.
So instead of spending hours on these like really complex configurations, Rails provided a more intuitive framework that just worked.
Exactly. And it also embraced this idea of rapid development, allowing developers to build prototypes quickly and just get their ideas up and running much faster. And it wasn't just about speed. Rails also encouraged best practices and promoted clean and maintainable code.
Sounds like a win-win. So Rails speeds up the development process and encourages better coding practices.
Absolutely. It became hugely popular, and to this day, Ruby on Rails is considered one of the most beloved web development frameworks out there. But the story of Ruby itself goes deeper than Rails.
Right. So what are some of the features that make Ruby stand out as a language, independent of any particular framework?
Well, one of the most defining features is its object-oriented nature. Everything in Ruby, even something as simple as a number or a string, is treated as an object. This might sound kind of technical, but it really impacts how you write and structure code.
Can you give me an example of how that might work in practice?
Absolutely. Let's say you're working with a string of text. In Ruby, that string isn't just a bunch of characters. It's an object with its own set of methods or actions that you can perform on it. You could use built-in methods to capitalize the first letter, search for a specific word, or even reverse the entire string.
Oh, I see. So each object comes with its own set of tools you can use.
Exactly. This object-oriented approach makes the code more organized and easier to read, understand, and maintain.
That makes sense. And I've heard Ruby is also known for its dynamic typing. Can you explain what that means?
In some languages, you have to explicitly declare the type of data a variable will hold, like saying, this variable will contain a number. Ruby, however, is much more flexible. It figures that out dynamically as the program runs.
So it's a bit more relaxed about data types.
Exactly. This flexibility allows for rapid prototyping and generally makes the code less verbose. You can quickly write and change things without getting bogged down in typed declarations. The downside is that some errors might not be caught until the program is actually running.
Interesting trade-off. It's a bit like choosing between a really well-structured plan and just going with the flow. Each approach has its own pros and cons.
That's a great way to put it. And this idea of going with the flow is actually pretty central to another core feature of Ruby, duck typing.
Duck typing. That sounds fun. Does it have anything to do with if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck?
You got it. In Ruby, we focus less on what an object is and more on what it can do. If it has the methods you need, you can use it, regardless of its specific class or type.
So functionality over strict categorization. Got it. Can you give me a real-world example?
Absolutely. Let's say you have different objects representing vehicles. A car, a bicycle, and a boat. They're all different, but they share the ability to move, right? In a strictly typed language, you might need separate methods to handle the movement of each type. But with duck typing, You can simply have a single move method that works on any object that can move, regardless of what type of vehicle it is.
That's clever. It seems like duck typing makes working with objects a lot more intuitive.
It does. It reduces the need for complex hierarchies and allows for more adaptable code. And this whole idea of flexibility and ease of use extends to one of Ruby's most loved features, its readable syntax.
I've heard that Ruby code is almost like reading plain English. How does that contribute to the overall developer experience?
It's all about making things easier for developers. When the code is easy to read, it's easier to write, debug, and maintain. Ruby syntax prioritizes clarity and conciseness, which really helps in this regard.
I can definitely see how Matz's vision of a developer-friendly language really shines through in all these core features.
Absolutely. And this is really just the tip of the iceberg. Ruby also has an extensive standard library packed with ready-to-use tools, and it supports a powerful technique called metaprogramming.
Metaprogramming. Sounds a bit like magic. We'll definitely need to explore that later on. But before we jump into that rabbit hole, what are some practical advantages of choosing Ruby for a project? We've talked about the developer experience, but are there other benefits?
Sure. We already talked about how quickly you can develop with Ruby, especially when you combine it with Rails. But Ruby is also really flexible thanks to that dynamic typing and duck typing we were talking about. This adaptability makes it suitable for a wide range of projects.
So Ruby isn't just for web applications then?
Not at all. While web development is a major strength, Ruby's versatility extends to other areas like prototyping, scripting, data analysis, and even system administration. And of course, there's the amazing and supportive Ruby community.
I imagine that a strong community can be a huge asset, especially for people who are new to a language. What makes the Ruby community stand out?
Rubyists are known for their helpfulness and willingness to share knowledge. There's a real sense of camaraderie in the community. It's very welcoming, both online and offline, with tons of forums, conferences, and meetups, all dedicated to Ruby.
So it sounds like the community is as important as the language's technical features. It's amazing how a shared passion can bring people together like that.
I agree. And it's one of the reasons why Ruby continues to thrive, even with competition from all these new languages popping up.
Okay, we've explored the upsides, but what about the challenges? Every language has its drawbacks. What are some potential downsides of choosing Ruby?
That's a great question. You're right, no language is perfect. One of the main criticisms of Ruby is its performance compared to languages like Python or V++D. It can be slower, particularly for computationally intensive tasks.
So speed might not be its strongest suit. Is that a deal breaker?
Well, it really depends on the specific requirements of the project. If you're building an application that needs to process massive amounts of data really quickly, then Ruby might not be the best choice. But for many web applications, especially where responsiveness and user experience are paramount, Ruby's performance is more than adequate, especially with optimizations in newer versions.
So it's all about choosing the right tool for the job, weighing the trade-offs between performance, developer experience, and things like code maintainability.
Exactly. And you also want to keep in mind that Ruby applications can sometimes use more memory compared to other languages. That's just something to be aware of if resource efficiency is a major concern.
Okay, so performance and memory usage are things to think about. Are there any other potential challenges that developers might face when they're working with Ruby?
One thing that can be a bit of a hurdle, especially for beginners, is metaprogramming.
Ah, yes, that mysterious concept you mentioned earlier. We'll dig into that in more detail later, but can you just give me a quick preview of why it can be challenging?
So metaprogramming lets you write code that can modify or generate other code at runtime. It's incredibly powerful and flexible, but it can also make code harder to understand if it's overused.
It sounds like it requires a pretty deep understanding of how Ruby works under the hood.
Yes, it's a tool that needs to be used carefully and with a clear understanding of its potential impact on code complexity.
That makes sense. I imagine there are also challenges related to, the constantly evolving programming world with all these new languages emerging.
That's another thing to consider. While Ruby is still widely used and very relevant, it's true that its popularity has dipped a little compared to some of the newer kids on the block, like JavaScript and Python.
So Ruby's facing some competition. Does that mean it's becoming obsolete or irrelevant?
Not at all.
Hmm.
Ruby still has a lot to offer, especially in web development and other areas where its strengths really shine. But it's good to be aware of the trends and, the advantages of other languages.
So, in the end, it's about choosing the right tool for the job, recognizing that different languages excel in different areas.
Exactly. And Ruby's focus on developer happiness and its clear, concise syntax will always be attractive selling points.
Sounds like Ruby is still a valuable tool to have in a developer's toolkit, despite the competition. And its future will probably depend on its ability to adapt, evolve, and keep meeting the needs of developers.
Absolutely. It's a language with a great community, a rich history, and a proven track record. It'll be interesting to see how it continues to evolve in the coming years.
We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into Ruby. We've looked at its origins, unique features, its strengths and weaknesses, and even introduced that mind-boggling concept of metaprogramming.
It's been a fascinating journey so far. I'm looking forward to diving even deeper in the next part of our exploration.
Me too. When we come back, we'll delve deeper into the Ruby community, explore the power of Ruby on Rails, and take a closer look at real-world applications of Ruby. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're continuing our exploration of the Ruby programming language. Before we took a break, we discussed Ruby's origins, its core features, and even touched on some of the challenges it faces. Now I want to shift gears a bit and focus on something that really sets Ruby apart. Its community.
The Ruby community is really special. It's a global network of passionate developers who are just incredibly supportive and helpful.
It's impressive how a programming language can foster such a strong sense of community. What do you think contributes to that?
Well, I think it goes back to Ruby's philosophy of putting the developer first, prioritizing happiness and enjoyment. When you actually enjoy working with a language, you're more inclined to share that enthusiasm and help others.
It's like a shared love for the craft.
Exactly. And this translates into tons of resources and support for Ruby developers, especially for those just getting started. There's a wealth of documentation, online forums, and even in-person meetups where you can get help, ask questions, and connect with other Rubyists.
That sounds like a great environment to learn and grow in. Having a supportive community can make all the difference.
Absolutely. And it's not just about helping beginners. The community's really active in sharing code, building tools, and contributing to the language's evolution.
So it's a truly collaborative environment where everyone benefits.
Yes. And you see this reflected in the huge ecosystem of libraries and frameworks available for Ruby. Those are often called gems, right?
Right, gems. I've heard the term, but I'm not entirely sure what they are or why they're so important.
Think of gems as prepackaged bundles of Ruby code that provide ready-made solutions for all sorts of tasks. You need to connect to a database, there's probably a gem for that. Want to send emails or process images, there's probably a gem for that too.
So it's like a vast library of pre-built components that you can just plug into your applications.
Exactly. Gems save you a ton of time and effort because you don't have to write everything from scratch. And they really showcase the collaborative spirit of the Ruby community. And this brings us to the most famous gem of all, Ruby on Rails.
Oh, Rails. We touched on this earlier, but I think it deserves a deeper look. It's more than just a framework. It's kind of a legend in the world of web development.
Rails really did revolutionize web development. It took all the elegance and power of Ruby and streamlined the process of building web applications. It made things incredibly efficient and even fun.
Fun. That's not a word you often hear when people talk about web development. What makes Rails so enjoyable to work with?
A big part of it is Rails' focus on the don't repeat yourself principle, or DRY. It's all about convention over configuration. Instead of writing lots of repetitive code, you follow established conventions, and Rails handles a lot of the underlying complexity for you.
So it's like Rails anticipates your needs and provides a clear path for building common web application features.
Exactly. This really reduces the mental burden on developers, allowing them to focus on the unique aspects of their application.
That sounds like a huge productivity boost. Are there other design principles in Rails that contribute to this positive developer experience?
Another key one is separation of concerns. Rails encourages you to clearly separate different parts of your application. The model, which deals with data, the view, which presents data to the user, and the controller, which manages the interaction between them.
It's like having different departments within a company, each with its own area of responsibility.
That's a great analogy. And this modular design makes your code much easier to understand, test, and maintain.
Speaking of testing, I know Rails is big on test-driven development, or TDD. Why is that so important in the Rails world?
TDD encourages you to write tests for your code before you actually write the code itself. It might seem counterintuitive, but it forces you to think deeply about how your code should behave and helps you build the right thing from the get-go.
It's like having a detailed blueprint before you start building a house.
Exactly. TDD leads to more reliable and maintainable code because you have a whole set of tests that automatically check whether any changes you make break existing functionality.
So TDD is about building a safety net for your code to make sure it stays healthy as you make changes and add new features.
Precisely. It's one of the things that makes Rails such a robust framework.
Rails really seems to have a well thought out approach to the entire development process.
Yes, and that focus on developer experience, combined with the power and flexibility of Ruby, is what makes Rails so popular and effective.
So beyond the technical aspects, what's it actually like to work with Rails?
Developers often describe working with Rails as enjoyable and productive. It's designed to make common web development tasks easy and intuitive.
So Rails handles a lot of the heavy lifting, allowing developers to focus on the creative side of things.
Exactly. It's like having a really capable assistant who takes care of all the tedious details, freeing you up to focus on the big picture.
No wonder it has so many fans.
Hmm?
It's great that a framework can not only simplify web development, but also make it more enjoyable.
I agree. It's a great example of how good design and developer experience can go hand in hand.
We've talked about the philosophy and the benefits, but what about real-world examples? Are there any companies or well-known applications that are using Rails successfully?
Oh, tons. Rails is behind some of the most popular websites and platforms out there. Companies like Shopify, GitHub, and Airbnb have all leveraged Rails to build their systems.
Wow, that's a pretty diverse range. From online stores to code repositories to travel bookings, it seems like Rails is used in a wide variety of industries.
It really is. And these are just a few examples. Countless other companies, big and small, rely on Rails to power their web applications. Its scalability, reliability, and ease of use make it a great choice for businesses of all sizes.
It's amazing to think that a framework that grew out of the Ruby community is now such a big part of the web. It really shows the power of open source and the impact a passionate community can have.
Couldn't agree more. And remember, Ruby's not just limited to web development. It's also really effective in areas like DevOps, system automation, and even tasks like web scraping and data analysis.
It seems like Ruby's got a lot of tricks up its sleeve.
That's one of the reasons why it continues to be a relevant and popular language. It's versatile, it's fun to work with, and it has a fantastic community behind it.
We've covered a lot in this part of our deep dive. We explored the Ruby community, dug into the world of Ruby on Rails, and saw how Ruby is being applied in all sorts of interesting areas. It's clear that Ruby is much more than just a language. It's an ecosystem, a philosophy, and a way of approaching software development.
I completely agree. Ruby's enduring popularity speaks to its elegance, power, and the passion of the people who use it.
I'm looking forward to wrapping up our exploration in the final part of this deep dive. Up next, we'll venture into the exciting and sometimes mind-bending world of metaprogramming in Ruby. We'll unravel the mysteries of this powerful technique, explore its benefits and potential pitfalls, and see how it can be used to write incredibly elegant and flexible code. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We're wrapping up our exploration of Ruby, and I'm really excited to finally dig into this concept of metaprogramming. It seems to be one of those things that Ruby developers either love or are kind of intimidated by.
It's definitely powerful, and like with any powerful tool, you got to use it carefully. But it can also make your code incredibly elegant and flexible.
Okay, I'll admit, I'm intrigued. But I'm not going to lie, the idea of code that can change other code while it's running, well, it's a little scary, to be honest. I get it, it's a lot to wrap your head around. But let's break it down. At its core, metaprogramming in Ruby is about writing code that can essentially look at, understand, and even modify other parts of your program as it's running.
So instead of just defining what the program does, you're giving it the ability to change itself on the fly.
Exactly. It's a way to give your code a degree of self-awareness. It can look at itself, analyze itself, and even adapt based on different conditions.
Whoa, that's powerful. But I can see how that could be a recipe for disaster if it's not used carefully.
Absolutely. It's not something you want to just throw around without thinking. But let's think about this. Imagine building a web application with, say, dozens of database tables, each with a bunch of columns. Writing code to interact with each of those tables and columns individually would be a nightmare.
Yeah, I can
Yeah.
see that getting really messy and repetitive fast.
Exactly. But now, imagine this. What if you could write code that could look at that database structure and automatically create the code you need to interact with it? That's what metaprogramming allows you to do.
Oh, wow. So it's like you're giving the code the ability to learn and adapt based on the data it's working with.
Exactly. It makes things so much more concise, and it lets your code be way more adaptable to changes in your data structure.
Now that you mention it, I remember how elegant Ruby on Rails is. Is metaprogramming the secret behind that?
You got it. A lot of the things that make Rails so powerful and easy to use are built on metaprogramming. For instance, when you define a model in Rails, you just list its attributes.
Yeah.
And Rails uses metaprogramming to automatically generate all the methods you need to work with those attributes.
So Rails is doing a lot behind the scenes to keep the code clean and simple for the developer. That's really clever.
It is. And that's just one example. Metaprogramming is all over Rails. It's used to create its intuitive syntax, to manage relationships between models, and even to define the routes for your application.
Okay, so it's obviously a big deal in Ruby, especially with Rails. But what are some of the actual techniques that developers use to do metaprogramming?
There are a bunch of different techniques, each with its own pros and cons. One that can be a little controversial is called monkey patching.
Monkey patching, what is that?
It basically lets you modify existing classes or methods, even those in the core Ruby libraries.
Mhm.
So if you need to add a feature to a library you're using but don't want to change the original code, monkey patching lets you kind of patch it in.
It's like a way to tweak the code without messing with the original.
Exactly. But it's definitely a tool that needs to be used very carefully. It can lead to unexpected behavior and can make your code harder to understand if you're not really careful.
Right, it's powerful, but it sounds like you need to know what you're doing. Are there other metaprogramming techniques that are commonly used?
Yeah, another one is dynamic method definition. This lets you create methods on the fly while the program is running, based on the situation or the data you're working with. You could, for example, create methods based on the names of files in a directory or based on something a user enters.
So your code becomes much more adaptable and dynamic. That's pretty cool.
It is. And then you have eval and classival. Those let you execute Ruby code that's stored in a string. Super powerful, but also potentially dangerous from a security perspective if you're not really careful about what code you're executing.
It sounds like metaprogramming is a bit of a double-edged sword. Incredibly powerful, but also a bit risky if you're not careful.
That's a good way to put it. It's definitely a tool that requires a good understanding of the language and a lot of responsibility.
Okay, so what are the most important things you want our listeners to take away from this conversation about metaprogramming?
Well, first, I want them to understand that it's not some kind of obscure or advanced concept that only a few Ruby experts can use. Metaprogramming is baked into Ruby, and it's used all over the place, especially in Rails. Understanding it can help you appreciate how Ruby works and how some of its most popular tools are built.
So it's useful knowledge even if you're not a metaprogramming guru yourself.
Right. And second, it's not just about being clever or showing off. Metaprogramming can be a really practical way to solve problems, automate tasks, and make your code more concise and maintainable.
It's about working smarter, not harder. And finally,
Finally, remember that it comes with great responsibility. You need to be aware of the potential downsides and use it judiciously to avoid creating code that's difficult to understand or maintain.
great advice. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into Ruby. We've covered a lot. Its history, its community, its strengths and weaknesses, and we even ventured into the mind-bending world of metaprogramming.
It's been a pleasure exploring Ruby with you. I hope our listeners enjoyed the journey as much as we did.
And to everyone listening, I encourage you to explore Ruby yourself. It's a beautiful and powerful language, and it's more than just writing code. It's about a way of thinking and a community of passionate developers.
Happy coding.
That's all for this episode of The Deep Dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.